Everyone, it's Daniel Elwood, and my co-host is Robert Paul Johnson. We are the Last Nighters. You can find us on the Launchpad Media, where they're always launching new ideas in your direction. Check it out at thelaunchpadmedia.com. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Hotel Rwanda, and this is the second attempt at this. So if it sounds a little canned or forced, it's because we are sort of repeating ourselves, or maybe we're not really sure. We rarely know what we're going to say, so I don't even know what I said yesterday. So it might be fresh. I don't know. We'll see. But our guest is super fresh. He is Jared Wall of Breaking Liberty and Anarcho-Land, and he has written an article recently regarding Rwanda called The Lie of Rwanda, and it is available at the Libertarian Institute. We'll have a link for that on our show notes page at lastnighters.com/142. And with that, we will introduce Jared. Welcome back to the show. We do appreciate you always as a guest. You are here for Breaking Bad, El Camino movie, Gold, and also Captain Phillips talking about Somali pirates. So welcome back.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me. Always fun to talk to you guys.
Oh, it is a lot of fun, especially when we do amateur hour and just have the internet crap out on us and have to re-record everything. It's a lot of fun. But if you could just remind people where they can find your work and maybe talk a little bit about the article just for a moment before we get into the Google description and start talking about the movie.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Breaking Liberty. That was, man, that seems like a long time ago now that I put together kind of, my subtitle is Libertarian Commentary on AMC's hit show. I was a big fan of Breaking Bad and ended up, when I was rewatching it with my wife, her for the first time, me for probably the third or fourth time, I just took out a notepad and was starting to jot things down of all the libertarian themes that could be pulled out of it, or the statist themes that a libertarian could complain about out of Breaking Bad, and ended up putting together a whole pretty lengthy couple of ebooks. So if those are available for free to download at breakingliberty.com. For a while, I had, as you mentioned, Anarcho-Land. I still own anarcholand.com, and I had a pretty decent sized Facebook page for a while, but I stopped doing that. I changed my focus to some other things. I do hope to get that back up and running at some point, but I've just focused my time elsewhere outside of work. But yeah, I just recently published a pretty lengthy article, essay, whatever you want to call it, as you said, titled The Lie of Rwanda. I had Scott Horton was nice enough to publish it at his thelibertarianinstitute.org, or I think it's just libertarianinstitute.org. But I don't know, I found it at least twice, in Libya back in 2010 and back in Kosovo back in the 90s, in the mid-late 90s. Rwanda was invoked as reason for why we have to go and militarily intervene, because there's these quote-unquote impending genocides, and we can't just sit around waiting and let another Rwanda happen like we did back in the early 90s with the so-called Rwanda genocide. And I ended up kind of going down a rabbit hole of reading books about the history of what preceded that and what actually happened during it and after those events in 1994, and basically put together everything I learned in that article, The Lie of Rwanda. And I'm pretty proud of how it came out. It actually ended up getting picked up by Zero Hedge and has been viewed 25,000 plus times. So it's gotten some play, and like I said, I'm pretty proud of that. So I think we'll probably get into some of that history as we go through and talk about the movie here. But I guess my big take on the movie is going to kind of repeatedly be that it's really just a piece of propaganda that perpetuates the idea that it was just a very random Hutu genocide against the Tutsis, and that the West sat back and did nothing when there's a lot more nuance to that people should understand to have a better, less cartoonish understanding of what happened back then.
All right, very good. Well, we'll definitely have a link to that article on our site at lastnighters.com/142. It is a pretty lengthy read. I think you said it was over 4,000 words, so it does take a little bit of time, but it goes through a lot of the history of not only Rwanda, but also the neighboring countries and the colonial periods, and how Germany and Belgium and France all influenced things in that area. So I think it's pretty interesting stuff. It's a lot of backstory, and it probably changes how people would view this movie, which we will get to right now with the old Google description, how we start this thing off. So here we go. Hotel Rwanda. It was PG-13, came out in 2004. It's called a war/drama film, 2 hours and 2 minutes. It got an 8.1 IMDb, 91% Rotten Tomatoes, and 79% on Metacritic, and 93% of Google users liked it. The description is: Paul Rusesabinga, played by John Cheadle, is a Hutu who manages the Hotel des Mille Collines, which means 1,000 hills, and lives a happy life with his Tutsi wife and their 3 children. But when Hutu military forces initiate a campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Tutsi minority, Paul is compelled to allow refugees to take shelter in his hotel. As the UN pulls out, Paul must struggle alone to protect the Tutsi refugees in the face of the escalating violence later known as the Rwandan genocide. The release date was December 22nd, 2004, and the director is Terry George, and Don Cheadle has a pretty strong performance in this. He got nominated for an Academy Award, did not win, but I think he made a name for himself in this particular movie. And we will go to Robert for your opening information, sir.
Well, okay. All right, then. So, like Jared was saying, this is it's a narrative told from one person's perspective. It's not a documentary giving us the full context and the scope and the history of the conflict. It's very much an insular slice of a bigger story. So, like you've said in the past, this is factual because this is what happened according to him, but not necessarily truthful in the sense you're getting the whole story as to why this is actually happening and actually what else is going on, right? It's just from his perspective, it's these Hutus that are going crazy, killing all these Tutsis because they're upset about some things that have happened in the past. And it's not necessarily predicated due to this invasion of this rebel Tutsi army from the other nearby country. But the movie itself is very much a local businessman tries to curry favor with powerful people to protect a vulnerable population. So it's very much Schindler's List set in Africa, where Paul tries to, get all kinds of like valuable goods that people just can't get. Like it starts off with him like having these Cuban cigars and handing them out to his friends because, money doesn't, at a certain point, it's like marginal utility, right? You get so much money and a little bit more money is really not that much. But if you can get a cigar that you just can't get otherwise, you're like, oh, so good, so classy, so much style. And so Paul is like currying all these favor with all these people. And in the extent that, or for the purpose of being able to call in his chips when he's in trouble. And the movie is essentially him calling in favors throughout the thing, getting people to protect this hotel from marauding Hutus, marauding soldiers from whatever faction, just wanting to go in there and kill whoever he's trying to protect. Now, I think currying favor and making yourself important to people is excellent strategy. It's a great survival strategy, making yourself important, too important to kill, right? Like you're worth more to me alive than you are dead. But at some point, shit hits the fan so hard that like nothing you could do is going to be worth it to me to protect you from all these hordes of people that want to kill you. So at that point, I think it's important to have your own defense force, some guns, some weapons on the bill. I mean, maybe that would be I mean, it'd just be at least another deterrent. Like at one point, there's like 4 UN guys in blue helmets that aren't even allowed to fire. And I understand, like, people are loath to shoot a UN guy because that would bring further reprisals, and you may be more likely to shoot, some African guy. But I mean, you could dress him up as a UN guy. I mean, you could do all kinds of things to actually, be a deterrent to protect your own place, because this movie is entirely about all the lengths he goes to protect the people, when I think he's ignoring some pretty obvious ones from my perspective.
Oh, that's interesting. Now I want to know more. So what are the obvious ones real quick?
The obvious ones, actually having weapons. Actually, if anybody comes and rolls up, they know they're going to get shot at. You could create choke points. You could have sandbags. You could actually take some guns off some dead soldiers, probably right outside your house, right outside the hotel. And if anybody comes rolling up in this Jeep, the actual approach to the hotel in the movie, I don't know about the real one, but in the movie, it's like this winding path. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's them not wanting to drive on the grass. I'm sure they would just drive on the grass. But you could, using burnt up vehicles, they got these vans, you got trees all over the place. You could actually defend that property in any number of ways other than just relying on the hope that nobody comes and kills you. There are strategic ways to set up your defenses that anybody would go, maybe I'll try the other place because this place looks like a porcupine and I'm not going to go into this porcupine.
Right. Yeah, it's just like we said in the pre-show, Jared, you got to just be faster than the other guy getting chased by the bear. So just be like that much more of a deterrent so it looks easier to go somewhere else. Now, I think the strategy that Paul was trying to employ, at least initially, was to have the appearance of still being an operating hotel. And for whatever reason, that would mean that they would be left alone for some reason. Perhaps because maybe the thinking was, well, there's people from other countries here, European clientele. And so if they were to attack the hotel, that would spark more of an international response versus just domestically, within Rwanda, killing other Rwandans. So maybe that was what kind of the thinking was there.
Right. And that's a good strategy, right? Like I said, that's a good strategy at the beginning, and it worked for the most part. But it doesn't work up to that point at which this shit fully hits the fan. And then no matter amount of diplomatic protection is going to do anything. And you actually have to have a gun in your hand to protect those people that you care about.
Right. Okay. Well, let's get Jared's take on the Google description and maybe a little bit of the backstory, at least how it's presented in the film. It's sort of shown to us that the Tutsis had been in charge for a long time, but they were the minority of the population. They got driven out by the Hutus, and then some Tutsis were invading back in, trying to take control of the government. And so that was what brought the Hutus into this situation of wanting to kill all the Tutsis. But we're not really given much more than that in the film.
Yeah, and even that is kind of being generous to what the film shows. I don't think it really got into those kind of details very well or very much at all. There was pieces of it, like they do reference invaders, and there is a little bit of dialogue when Joaquin Phoenix, I know it's Joaquin, but I prefer to say Joaquin. I think it's funnier. When Joaquin Phoenix was hitting on those girls in the bar, there's a little bit of dialogue about like the history, of what's caused the animosity between the Hutus and the Tutsis. With just for the Google description, my biggest problem with that is that it references, I forgot the verbiage, but it said something along the lines of the violence initiated by the Hutu government and the Hutu militias. And that's just a very false statement. The whole violence was initiated, the aggression started when, as you mentioned, Daniel, the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, invaded from Uganda. And that Rwandan Patriotic Front was kind of a faction of the Ugandan army. And it was made up by a whole bunch of former or the offspring of the former Tutsi elite that used to rule Rwanda up until the 1958. So I mean, I guess to maybe give a bit of that backstory, you know, there were animosities between. It's hard to say that there were animosities between all Tutsis and all Hutus. Like, that's just too much of a generalization. That's like saying all Sunnis hate all Shias. That's just not true. Like, they're just like in Iraq, Sunnis and Shias were friends and neighbors and intermarried and whatnot. The same thing is very true in Rwanda. So it was really more so animosity between elites of the two groups. But you know, getting back to kind of the history there, is that for a long time, for probably hundreds of years prior to imperialism, that part of Africa, which is really like Central Africa, right to the east of Congo, to the west of Lake Victoria, there were the two groups, generally speaking, and the Tutsis were it was almost like a feudal system, whereas the Tutsis were overlords and the Hutus were serfs. And then in 1885, with the Scramble for Africa and the Berlin Conference and all the fake boundaries and borders getting drawn, Germany came in and took control of what's now become known as Rwanda. And I don't know the history of how that name came to be. It probably existed a long time before there. But as far as the borders of Rwanda today, Germany came in 1885 and became the imperial power, and they ruled using Tutsi kings or Tutsi feudal overlords as their proxy rulers. And that continued when the imperialism changed hands from Germany to Belgium after World War I, and Germany lost all of their colonies. Belgium took over, and they continued the same thing, where they were just empowering and ruling through Tutsi elite ruling forces and feudal overlords. So they were using them as proxies.
So it's sort of like they already had an existing structure in place, and so it's just easier to utilize that sort of like as their puppet.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a really common strategy for imperialism. Like if you study the British Empire, you know, that's what they did in India and you know, Persia, etc. So they would pick kind of a minority group that had power and just empower them further and kind of rule through those groups.
Yeah, I can see how that could develop some more animosity, especially if you have groups within a country that are sort of distinct in some way. And in the movie, it's sort of presented like almost this eugenicist phrenology kind of differentiation, like how Jack Daglish, the Joaquin Phoenix, kind of talks about it, is like, well, they just sort of picked certain traits and they called that Tutsi, and other traits they called it Hutu. And it's really, you can't really tell the difference. Like when he picks up on the girls at the bar, he's like, they could be sisters, and one's Hutu and one's Tutsi. Now, I had this joke, like, well, are you saying they all look the same? Because to me, those two girls look very different from each other. But yeah, back to the point. It sounded like it was just sort of this pseudoscience of the day when the Belgians were in control, at least per the movie, where they were determining who was Hutu and who was Tutsi. And because those divisions got drawn, then it became tribal. Then it became, I'm Hutu, I'm Tutsi, and you know, your team sucks, my team's good, that kind of a thing. Where, you know, it's like if you divide like in psychological experiment, I think it was the Stanford prison experiment, you know, half the people based on like eye color or some other random selection were guards, and the other half were prisoners. And just putting them on those two teams developed different behaviors and different camaraderie within groups, and then antagonism between the groups. And I think that almost any time you divide up people into different sections, you're going to get that kind of phenomena.
Another thing, though, that I have a question about, thing that seems to divide and unite people and that sort of thing is language. And it seems like there's the original African language of something Rwanda. I don't know what the name. I have no idea.
Kinyarwanda.
There you go. And I assume that's spoken generally in the region by most Rwandans. But then they were originally colonized by the Germans and then later on the Belgians. But they're a mainly French-speaking nation. And then Paul speaks English. So, and I'm sure for the movie, probably they speak English. But maybe he was speaking French to the hotel owners. I don't know, but do you happen to know any of the back history on that? Because I know all of Africa was colonized by all the European powers, and I don't know, it's all a big clusterfuck.
That's a good question. I don't really know the answer to it. I mean, they use the francs too, French francs. So I don't really know how France got involved and when, and how they ended up being kind of a primarily French-speaking nation. That's a really good question. I maybe need to do some more research on that. But I mean,
is it a network effect where the majority of French people around them spoke French, and so that it behooved them to speak French also? Or
it's possible. And you know what? I'm not even that really good on what language. Like, is Belgian a language, or do they speak French in Belgium?
We should know
the wrong people.
we should know that, right? I don't think Belgian is a language. I'm going to sound stupid if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure they speak French in Belgium, and that might be a part of it.
Okay.
Anyways, but yeah, and I also, Daniel, to your point, I don't really know, kind of the tribal history there. There probably were different groups known as Tutsis and Hutus, but then, when the Germans and the Belgians came in, they were, just observing. They were like, oh, the Tutsis are taller, the Tutsis have skinnier noses, and that's how they kind of even perpetuated those kind of, I guess, more or less stereotypes. And
this is during the eugenic time, right? When there's a lot of this phrenology and eugenics is really kind of popular in the science, and
the late 1800s, early 1900s. Yeah,
figuring out who was good.
They were following the science of the day.
Indeed, they were.
Listening to the scientists.
These are the desirable traits versus the undesirable traits.
Yeah. So I think one of the key lines that they say is the code phrase that they say on the radio, the propaganda radio, that's like ginning up all these people's animosity and directing it towards specific targets. Their phrase was "cut the tall trees," and I wonder if that was sort of meaning like these are the people who have been a higher status than us, and now we're going to bring them down a notch, bring them down a peg. Because it kind of feels like that's sort of what's happening in real time in present day United States, where the prevailing like culture seems to be being torn down in favor of peaceful protests and peaceful fires and peaceful riots, and like targeting of what used to be like, the nuclear family and the common culture, Western values and civilization is kind of being torn apart right now. I don't know if I'm saying anything that's like too crazy, but it just kind of, I see some similarities between what we witness in this movie to present day, and it makes me a little nervous.
Well, it's definitely a revolutionary event, right? At least it is depicted in the film. Whether or not, I mean, actual history would just say otherwise, but in the film, it definitely seems like a revolutionary. They are just intent on destroying, tearing down what exists, and not necessarily working on building up something great. So yeah, I would concur with your assessment there in terms of what seems to be happening with the modern far leftists and their riots and agitations. Yeah, they seem to just be. They're not actually talking about replacing what they're tearing down with anything good. It doesn't seem. Just get rid of this bad stuff that we don't like.
It certainly was revolutionary in the term, in the sense that, the Habyarimana's Hutu government was overthrown and a Tutsi government came to power led by Paul Kagame. But that being said, when you think of a revolution, you kind of think of, I guess at least here in America, it was like an internal uprising where, there were a growing force inside of the country that overthrew their government and installed something else. Where in this case, it was, like I said earlier, it was an invasion from outside. It was an invasion from a segment of the Ugandan army. So in that sense, it was more of like it was an invasion. It was an invasion that was an aggressive war against a democratically elected government.
Now, in the film, the Tutsi rebels, that's the group you're talking about, right? That's how they're referred to, the rebels. Now, they do show up in the film, and they talk about how they're moving into the city and they're moving through, and then they think that it's going to be peaceful after they take over, and the Hutus have to retreat, and then they're seen as like the good guys. But in terms of what you've written, it sounds like they are not the good guys. But you can't really necessarily say the Hutus are good guys either, especially not, I mean, what they were doing. I mean, they just turned on their neighbors. They weren't actually just fighting this invading force. They were like, oh, shit's going down. It's time to get our kill on.
Yeah, I mean, it's a war, so there's no real good guys and bad guys. There's atrocities committed by both sides against both sides, and against a lot of innocent people who had nothing to do with it. That being said, when the RPF invaded from Uganda, all of the Hutus obviously fled away because they were like, oh crap, there's this Tutsi army marching south from Uganda. We're in trouble. We got to get away from here. But also all of the, I guess not all, a lot of the Tutsis who were still living in Rwanda who had nothing to do with the RPF also fled away from the RPF because they were like, oh crap, this isn't good. This is going to basically just once again set off all of these tensions between Hutus and Tutsis. And, they were afraid of reprisal killings from, with the history that had been had gone back a long ways in Rwanda, with Hutus being basically serfs to Tutsi overlords, there probably was a certain level of fear of returning to that kind of situation. And I mean, interestingly, when Habyarimana came to power, I said democratically elected, but it was actually, he led a coup against a government back in 72, I think. But from 72 to 1990, when the RPF invaded, it was a time of relative peace. People were happy. There wasn't all of this sectarian killing going on like we saw in the movie, or like what happened for 4 years between 1990 and the so-called genocide in April to July of 1994. So kind of lost my train of thought there, but I mean, there were definitely atrocities committed by both sides, but one side started it, to kind of make a closing point there.
Well, it definitely seems like this is a kind of a history written by the winners situation. I mean, you've got the Tutsi army that invades and actually capture the capital, right? And then they're still in power to this day. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, the RPF, because I mean, another interesting point is that the genocide ended in July of 1994, when it was a genocide against the Tutsis. The genocide, so-called genocide, ended in July of 1994 when the Tutsi army won the war. So it's kind of, it doesn't really ring true that the genocide against the Tutsis ended when the Tutsis won the war. It kind of goes against the whole narrative that a genocide was, that it was just a straight up genocide. It's more complicated than that. But yes, the RPF, they shot down Habyarimana's plane in April of 1994, which was really the triggering point, and it's referenced in the movie, that they shot down the plane. And that was really the triggering point of the Hutu militias and what was left of Habyarimana's Hutu military and army just going crazy and starting to just slaughter Tutsis. regardless of whether they were a part of the RPF or not. But the RPF overthrew, or they killed Habyarimana, and then in July of 1994 they overthrew what was left of that Hutu government, and then Kagame, who was the leader of the RPF, has been in power ever since then, and to this day.
And this narrative that this is just a big Hutu massacre is something that the West, or at least the United States, really appreciates, because a lot of the RPF was trained and funded by the United States. Is that correct?
Well, yes, a lot of the Ugandan army was very heavily trained and funded by the U.S. Since Museveni is a dictator of Uganda, he's been in power since '86, and even just in the years between '86 and 1990, when the RPF invaded, the U.S. gave him hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars in aid and military aid and weapons and training. And when the RPF invaded, Paul Kagame, who, like I said, he was one of the main generals of the RPF, he was, at the time of the invasion, he was in the U.S. at Fort Leavenworth studying psyops and propaganda and things like that. And then very early on, after the RPF invaded, the UN placed an embargo on arms shipments into Rwanda, and that embargo was enforced extremely strictly in the case of Habyarimana's government, but it was ignored almost entirely in terms of the RPF invaders. Like, throughout the entire war from 1990 until 1994, Uganda was routinely shipping money, arms, ammunition, supplies, men into Uganda to join the RPF and continue that fight.
So maybe that's why in the movie, like, the Hutus are receiving shipments of machetes because they can't get other, like firearms.
They got them from like China, right? Like some machetes from China for like 10 cents or something.
Yeah, super cheap, good price. And in our first attempt at recording yesterday, Jared, I think you were saying that when the RPF started to invade and the Tutsis who were still living in Rwanda, the Hutus were worried about potential sleeper cells from the people who were still living in Rwanda and were Tutsi. And so they were probably of the thought that we don't know who we can trust, who is potentially a subversive, who, they're our neighbor, but they're Tutsi and they might be a sleeper cell. So that might have been a motivating factor for when, in times of war, they felt it was a thing they needed to do to kill all the Tutsis. And, I'm by no means condoning it, but I can kind of like start to see some of the thought process that might lend itself to that, especially when they're being ginned up and propagandized. They're sort of like useful idiots that are being kind of funneled into certain actions that are desirable by the elites pulling the strings.
Right, and dehumanizing their enemy. Like, these cockroaches need to die. And you're talking about like old men, old women, children, and they're just going to hack them all to pieces.
Yeah, I mean, the RPF bragged about having sleeper cells inside of Rwanda at the time of the invasion, and even, in the days leading up to the invasion. And so, yeah, I mean, it definitely makes sense that there would be a certain fear and distrust of anybody who's a Tutsi, because, the invading force, who is led by elite Tutsis, are saying, hey, we've got these partners that are ready to join us in the fight once we cross the border and once we start fighting. And an important point to make is that when the RPF invaded, it wasn't like they just straight up went after Habyarimana's Hutu military and Hutu army. They just there was a scorched earth campaign. So they were committing all kinds of atrocities from 1990 through the end of the war and killing a whole bunch of innocent people. And even in the so-called genocide time period from April to July of 94, there's some estimates that more Hutus were killed during those months than Tutsis. So again, the simple narrative that this was a Hutu against Tutsi genocide just doesn't really, it's hard for that to hold water.
Yeah, I think maybe it was listed in your article or something else I was reading in preparation for this, but there was some argument that there was almost a double genocide from both sides that was at play here. So there's really a lot more going on. And as part of the movie was shot in Kigali, is that how you say the name of the city? So
I
in
think
Rwanda.
so. I think so. Kigali. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would think that then they would have had to have permission to be there from the Tutsi-led government, and so the story might have been, sort of massaged into what we see here by a guy who's led Rwanda since he invaded in the 90s, Kagame, who was trained in psychological psyops, and propaganda. So you'd see a movie like this come out. Of course, his side's going to be the heroes, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I mean, I think it also leads into, an interesting kind of commentary. I mean, I think you're definitely right that in order for him to sign off on it being filmed or having, film crews come in and make this movie, it had to be somewhat, geared towards being sympathetic to his side. But it's interesting because, like I said, the RPF was a break off of the Uganda military. So Kagame, even before, from 86 through 90, Kagame was very high up in Museveni's National Resistance Army, which is the Ugandan army. He was actually the chief of intelligence to Museveni. So he was really tight with Museveni at the time. Since then, though, especially like in the late 90s and early 2000s, Kagame and Museveni have become like enemies. Even though they work together on overthrowing the Habyarimana government, as Kagame, I guess, got more and more power, being the leader of a whole nation as opposed to just a general and an invading army. There's been some serious tensions between Rwanda and Uganda. And similarly, this Paul Rusesabinga, I think I'm saying that right. He's now been ever since 1994. As it kind of shows at the end of the movie, him and the people that he saved left the country. He's been outside of the country ever since then, and has been a very vocal critic of Kagame's government, even warning of a new genocide happening that was going to be Tutsi-led against the Hutus. And just recently, like a couple of weeks ago, he was extradited from, I think it was Dubai. It might have been the UAE, but he was extradited from there back to Rwanda, and now he is facing all kinds of criminal charges, including terrorism and subversion, or I don't know the whole list of charges, but it's something like 13 charges, and he was detained without access to a lawyer for a few days, and without having even his charges brought against him, without being able to see his family. So he was almost kind of black bagged for a while. But that's an ongoing and developing story, but it kind of just goes to speak to the nature of the Kagame government today.
So do we have any idea what the demographics of Rwanda are currently? Is it majority Tutsi now, or is it still the same kind of thing that was before, majority Hutu but minority-led Tutsi?
I mean, I think it's still got to be majority Hutu. I don't know exactly the demographics today, but throughout the history of that area, it's always been 80-90% Hutu and 10-20% Tutsi, and that's not going to change too drastically.
And they're not having like elections or anything, are they?
No, they are, but Kagame keeps getting like 90%, 95%. But
they have elections.
Yeah, they're contested or not necessarily like totally believable.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think in some cases they even have elections where there's one name on the ballot. So I'm not 100% sure of that, but I know that happened in Yemen back in like 2000. Is that there was a one name election, and they called it. I think Hillary Clinton decried it as like the triumph of democracy when that happened in Yemen, and I'm pretty sure similar stuff
Like you can select from this Tutsi guy or that Tutsi guy. It's like there's your.
You can select from Paul Kagame or Paul Kagame.
By the way, everyone, we got one of our listeners has said that French is one of the 3 official languages of Belgium alongside Dutch and German. So thank you, Facebook user. You didn't do the permissions to show the name, but thank you for the correction for us, so we can actually learn something on this show. So that's what we do here. We learn stuff. Also, apparently,
it sounds like he was saying that we were right. I don't.
Yeah, but now we know. But now we know.
Right,
We were
now we're sure of it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Facebook user.
Another trivia note. I guess the word Rwanda, it means 1,000 hills. So the Hotel Collines is Belgian for 1,000 hills, but Rwanda is 1,000 hills for whatever the name origin was. So I guess French. Is it French? Or is Rwanda
I thought we just determined that there is no such thing as the Belgian language.
Oh, right. Yeah, French. Yeah, sorry. but the word Rwanda, I think, is more related to the Rwandan language that you were talking about earlier, that would mean 1,000 hills as well. And so that what ties the name of the hotel together with the name of the country. All right. Yeah. There we go. See, convoluted. I feel like I'm Biden up here, reading off a teleprompter, playing some music for everyone. Did you guys see that? He's like playing some, I don't even know, like Mexican music. He's trying to like pander to get the vote. And Trump actually tweeted a re-edited version of Biden up there holding the phone, playing it with NWA's "Fuck the Police." It's hilarious. I'll have to send that to you guys.
Okay, I'll have to check that out.
Please do. I always like to laugh at Joe Biden, so I would appreciate you sending that over.
Well, we might get disabled. Unbelievable.
We might get 4 years of laughing at him. We'll see. We'll see if he can last.
We can only hope.
Well, one other thing I wanted to bring up, sort of related to the movie, and I don't know if this played out per se in real life or not, but I've seen this kind of thing happen in other movies depicting these dystopian kind of futures or dystopian situations where neighbor turns on neighbor. And so you can basically just, if there's somebody you don't like for whatever reason, you just say, oh yeah, I heard they're a spy. Or yeah, I heard they're a Tutsi. I mean, you kind of see it even today in the pandemic, or like swatting is like a tactic.
He's a racist. That guy's a racist over there. Let's beat his ass.
Right.
That's an obvious, easy mob tactic.
Yeah, or he's a Trump supporter or whatever. And it's something that you see like in East German Stasi, and they talk about it in this with Victor the gardener and Paul. When they see that their neighbor's getting taken away, they don't feel like there's anything they can do, and I kind of feel like, yeah, I mean, what would you do? There's armed military like taking your neighbor away. What are you going to do?
Right, and Paul wanted his wife wanted him to call in some favors to protect his neighbor, but he was like, no, we got to save those for ours. We don't have an unlimited supply of favors we can draw on, which is true. He didn't.
Right. Yeah. And it seemed like that was like the modus of modus operandi. Yeah. Of like a socialist type country, which I imagine Rwanda kind of was, to where you're doing these things to kind of curry favor, to get kind of like unofficial favors, to get things done, to kind of grease palms and to get around some of the bureaucracy that might otherwise be in your way. So I think that was one of the kind of things that played a role in this. And when he was talking about getting those Cuban cigars, it might have been a joke, but he said, say hi to Fidel for me. So it makes me think that maybe they had sympathetic leanings towards Cuba and socialist nations.
Possibly, absolutely. I did want to talk a little bit about the movie in terms of like the scenes. There's a few scenes that are kind of a little bit interesting. There was one where, like you were saying, that the marauding like Hutu militia was kind of like running around and black bagging these Tutsis. And at one point they come in to Paul's house and he's like, you're coming in with me. We're going to go open up this safe at this hotel. And he's like, okay, I got to bring my family with me. And then they get to the hotel. He opens it up. He comes back out and he's like, "You lied to me, Paul. These are all cockroaches." And so then Paul then has to negotiate with this terrorist to not murder his friends and family. And he ends up basically bribing the guy not to murder them. And it just struck me how weak his position was. I mean, sure, he was outnumbered. He was outgunned heavily. Of course, he didn't have a weapon himself. But here he was negotiating with this guy who was going to murder all these people, who saw them as less than human or absolutely just the enemy, even though they're just like helpless women and children and old people. And here Paul is bargaining for their lives, and he's like giving them all this money and whatever on the spot. But what's to stop the guy? I mean, you're kind of trusting the honor of this terrorist to uphold the bargain, right? And to not just be like, murder them the next day, or have you bribed him, fine, but you didn't bribe that other guy over there and that other guy over there. Who's to say those guys aren't just going to open up his machine gun on him? It just seemed like a really weak position. He got away with it, but I just hated seeing him in that vulnerable position. And I think he could have learned something from that at some point and that was in the beginning of the movie. And then he just kept that same tactic the whole movie. And I really wanted him to grow as a character and realize that he had to do something physical to actually protect those people that he cared about, but he didn't.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. But I don't know what he really could have done. It didn't seem like he was a guy who was like super into, having a bunch of skills, nunchuck skills and bow staff skills to be able to protect himself or his family. And I don't know what the position of having arms themselves was, or even if they were available. But he did say that he wasn't a guy who was a fan of guns, because when that guy said, "You have to kill one of these cockroaches," he declined, saying that he wasn't a fan of using guns. So it probably wasn't in his nature. Also, Paul seemed to be fairly naive, especially early on in the film. Like when his brother and sister-in-law come and they're like, "Hey, we're hearing these things. We want to get out of here." And he's like, "No, I'm sure everything will be fine. Just wait till tomorrow. We'll talk tomorrow." And of course, that night, they end up getting taken, and then his two nieces end up missing for a long, long time. But it kept feeling like Paul didn't take the situation seriously enough early enough for my liking.
Right. And that's why I'm okay with him bargaining that first time, like in the beginning of the film. From a narrative standpoint, you got a growth opportunity for that character. And I know they wanted to tell kind of a historical story and what actually kind of happened from this guy's perspective. But if you want to make a compelling narrative, you have him learn the lesson of being in that weak position in the beginning, and then work towards not being in that weak position later on. It just seemed like a natural growth opportunity for the character that didn't happen in the film, and that's kind of missed opportunity.
I think he did try a few other tactics, especially after the UN was pulling out. He went for the emotional heartstrings of having everyone who was a refugee there contact anyone they knew internationally and have that conversation like, "This is the last time you're going to talk to me because I'm going to die," to try to get some action. And then when he talked to the CEO of Sabina, he got him to contact the Prime Minister of France to somehow prevent some other attack on the hotel from happening. Like he kept pulling strings further and further up the chain as best as he could. So he was escalating at least like the path that he was using to try to get further protection.
I agree, but he was also established as a person that could get things. And if you're telling me that in the middle of a war, you can't get yourself a crate of AK-47s, I don't know what to do, man. I just don't know. And you wouldn't even have to have people skilled or trained in how to shoot them. You stick an AK-47 in each room facing the road, and you just say, "Hey, someone stick your AK out when we blow a whistle." And then all of a sudden there's like 50 or 100 guns pointing at you when you're just coming up to roll up on the place. You're going to turn around and run away real fast.
They would look pretty badass.
Yeah, it'd be a porcupine. You'd be like, no gracias. I'm gonna go at the other place that isn't loaded for bear. I don't know. It just seemed like an obvious thing to me that didn't happen, and I was kind of questioning why.
Yeah. Now, one other thing I wanted to ask, and then we're gonna have to start winding down. It's somehow we've almost used an hour already. But another thing that Paul did was he came to an agreement with his wife to where if the hotel were attacked and the militia were there, he told his wife to jump off the top of the building with the kids. And there's a moment in the film where you don't know what's happened because they're there and Paul has just gotten back. And, you know, it's a harrowing, frightening experience. And this movie does pull on some emotional levers here. But there's a period of time where you think she might have done it. And, of course, you know, spoilers, it's revealed that she hasn't done it. But if she had followed along with what they agreed to do, then she would have done it. And I think that he would have learned from that experience to not have such a plan in place. Though I kind of understand why you would do it, because getting hacked to death with a machete over the course of hours would be a far worse way to go than a more sudden situation. You know, like seeing your wife or kids hacked up or, you know, worse, violated in other ways. I think I'd rather, you know, be the quick kind of less suffering kind of way of going.
Sure, I'd agree. And I also question what her plan was when she had the whole family hide in the bathtub, as if they wouldn't look behind the curtain. Okay.
Oldest trick in the book.
I mean, I get you. There aren't a whole lot of places, but there's got to be crawl spaces. There's got to be an attic. I don't know. There's got to be something.
That was a nice little piece of comic relief there too, when she was pointing the shower sprayer thing outwards as if she was going to shoot somebody with the shower.
If he had been armed, that's a good way to get yourself shot first, which I guess is maybe the best way to go. I don't know.
And Paul says to her, "What were you going to do with this?" That was really funny.
Yeah,
indeed.
And in the midst of a whole bunch of non-funny stuff, that was a little piece of humor.
Yeah, but the movie does have a good heart. I would agree with that. It's all based on family and a man trying to protect his family. So I think there's going to be plenty of room for people to empathize with the character. So I can see why this movie was as well received as it was. And the actual history of the conflict is completely unknown, I would think, in the West. So I think this movie is going to play really well here. So I could see how well that would do. Yeah,
I mean, to the extent that the West people here know anything about the conflict, it's you know, it's the phrase I used earlier. It's kind of a cartoon version that, you know, there was a genocide and we sat around on our hands and did nothing, even though we knew it was going to happen and we could have done something, but we didn't. And now, you know, from now on, anytime there's an impending genocide, we have to, you know, send in the Marines and send in the Predator drones and stop it. And it's become a propaganda narrative to allow, you know, Barack Obama to invade Libya, or to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya, to allow Bill Clinton to invade and overthrow, or to cause all the chaos in Kosovo and Bosnia back in the 90s. You know, this false narrative as to what happened in Rwanda has led to a lot of it's been really good for the military industrial complex. And so, I mean, that's why, you know, I appreciate you guys having me on to talk about the movie. I definitely would encourage people to go and read my article about it and get a little bit more of a longer kind of revisionist history, or a more expansive history as to what actually happened, what actually led up to this, and what has happened since then, and also what might have been some of the motivating factors to the West siding with the Tutsi invaders, the RPF invaders, and why they've been so friendly to Museveni, you know, the Ugandan dictator, why they've given him so much money and arms and weapons, and, you know, not to spoil the surprise, it's because there's a whole bunch of very valuable resources in that part of Africa. There's trillions of dollars worth of gold and platinum and coltan and all kinds of stuff that, Congo, I just looked it up recently. The Congo, which neighbors to the west, both Uganda and Rwanda, is the poorest country in the world per capita, but they have probably the most natural resources in the whole world. So theoretically, it should be the richest country in the world, but it's the poorest, and it's because there's all these external powers fighting for control of those resources, or at least in large part, that's a big reason. They don't have a very good government themselves, but even that is a lot of the fault of outside influences.
Yeah, lots of interesting stuff. And your article is up on libertarianinstitute.org, and we'll have a link to that on our show notes page, lastnarratives.com/142. And we're probably at the point where we got to get into some final summary and review. So, Robert, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off and give us a rating.
Sure. Well, this is the movie that seemingly launched Don Cheadle's career. This is the first thing I ever saw him in. I'm sure he did some smaller stuff before this, but he has since gone on to become quite the movie star. And it's no wonder why. He's quite good in this. His role allows for all kinds of different emotions and different ways to play the character. At one point, he breaks down. He runs over all these dead bodies, and he's trying to change his clothes to continue on with his day, and he just can't take it. He's affected. He's a human being, and he's not just this robot that can keep on going in the face of all this horror. So, yeah, like we've said, this movie it's kind of a cartoonish tale of the actual events. It's definitely told from one person's perspective, showing a very narrow view of the conflict. But what it does, and I can't really fault it for that. It's not a documentary in the same way that Schindler's List wasn't a documentary. It was definitely, Schindler's List was also a propaganda piece. Not to say that none of the events happened. I'm sure they absolutely did happen, but it was definitely told from a certain perspective to tell a particular, to generate support for a particular way of looking at the thing. Same with this. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing. I don't really know. We didn't really get into Jared's view on whether this movie was ultimately a positive thing or not. It has brought more eyeballs onto the events in Rwanda from the winner's perspective, which is, of course, going to be very skewed. But the movie, it's pretty janky looking, especially in the beginning. There's some pretty bad green screen of them in this van at the beginning. It seems like those were the scenes that were shot probably on a soundstage later on. Maybe he has some pickup, or they decided that they just needed some more stuff. They couldn't shoot in this place anymore. They had to pick it up later. And it just doesn't look great. At the beginning, you're watching this movie and you're like, is this just like a made-for-TV movie? Doesn't look good. But the acting and the story does hold up. Like I said, the storyline of just a man trying to protect what he loves against overwhelming odds is strong. Even though I don't think that the character really grows a whole lot, but it's based on real events, and they wanted to be a little more accurate to the character instead of trying to Hollywood it up or trying to storyfy it. So I can't really complain too much. I would give it I don't know. It's hard to give a propaganda movie really high rating, but at the same time, from a propaganda rating, from an accurate, description of the conflict, it's very low. But if as an entertaining film, it's more of like a 7. But it is what it is. It's if you actually go and look at more of what's happening in the world, hopefully you're not just watching this and saying, oh, that's what happened, and then that's it, and then you have no more curiosity. If it inspires you to learn more, then it's a good thing. If it doesn't, and it satisfies your curiosity and you think all that happened, then maybe it's not so good.
All right. Well, Robert, that's a pretty good take. And I'll just echo that if this does pique your interest, then Jared's article will give you a lot of the nuance and the prehistory to the events in this that precipitate what we see on the screen, and even correct some of the things. As we were discussing earlier, there were atrocities kind of on both sides and a lot of precipitating events, a lot of outside influences, a lot of things were in play, and we just see a very narrow view of it from one man's perspective. And it is a story about family, and I'm just going to kind of dive into my review here. And his quest to survive and protect the people that he loves and the people that he's able to protect as best as he can. And there's a whole lot of emotion that's being toyed with here. I felt my eyes well up a little bit because I thought of like how I would handle that situation with my wife and my kids. I don't know if I could handle it as well as Paul did in real life, and as Don Cheadle's portrayal of it was in the movie. But it was a gripping, entertaining piece, and it does bring at least some notoriety to a horrible event that would probably otherwise not be anything other than something that was on the news on CNN or headline news for a couple of weeks at some point 25 years ago. So for that, I think it does bring some much needed recognition to an area and an event that happened. And there's a lot more that you can dig into. And one of those things is Jared's article that we were talking about earlier. But from a technical aspect, yeah, I think that there's some flaws with the movie. It's not like the most well executed. The green screen is pretty bad. Nick Nolte's character, he's very cardboard cutout. But, it's a bit of a one note thing. But it's still interesting, and it's still worth the watch. And so I'm glad I saw it, and I'm glad that we discussed it tonight, especially having a guest like Jared on who knows a lot about the history of the area and just about Africa in general. So with that, we'll go over to you, Jared, for your final summary and a score. Oh, I need to give a score. I'm going to give it a 7 as well. There we go. 7 from me.
Yeah, I mean, really enjoyed listening to both of your takes there. If it were strictly kind of a work of fiction, I think it's an excellent movie. I think it's very entertaining. It pulls on the heartstrings, and like what you're saying, Daniel, it really, if you can, it shows the horrors of war very, very well, and just how terrible the situation war is, and why war should be avoided and opposed, 100% of the time. Aggressive war, that is. And I guess it's just, for me, it's, kind of, Robert, what you were saying, that, if it were to inspire somebody to go and learn more about what happened in the history of it, I unfortunately, I just don't have a very high opinion of the average American viewer of this movie. I don't think many of them will. I think they'll watch it as if it was a documentary, and then it kind of just goes to perpetuate the propaganda that's gone along with the fact, or the so-called fact, that there was a genocide in Rwanda, and the West knew it was happening, yet sat on their hands and did nothing, and therefore we have to intervene in all similar cases moving forward. Like I said, it was just 10 years ago that Samantha Power and Susan Rice in Barack Obama's administration invoked the memory of Rwanda as justification for overthrowing Gaddafi and turning Libya into just a complete chaos state. Slave auctions came back to Libya, like real life, people up on stands and people bidding for them. It came back to Libya because of that intervention, and because, in part, this lie that I call it of what happened in Rwanda back in 1994 was cited as reason of why they needed to do it. As far as the movie itself goes, you're right. The green screens were pretty bad in some cases. Don Cheadle's acting was phenomenal. Nick Nolte and Joaquin Phoenix's acting were not phenomenal. One of the things that really I mean, in addition to them constantly referring to the RPF invaders as rebels and conjuring up the image that this was an internal rebellion against an oppressive government, which is was not the case at all. In addition to that, you know, the movie gets the timeline of what happened, even you know, in just that narrow period that the movie was set in. It gets that all wrong. You know, it references peace talks and a peace agreement, and then it references Habyarimana's plane getting shot down, and then everything goes to haywire. Those peace agreements was almost a year prior to all of this happening, and the movie makes it seems like it was, you know, one right after the other. So I took a little bit of issue with that. I also took issue with their portrayal of the UN's involvement. It kind of showed Nick Nolte and the UN as you know, standing around and doing nothing, when in reality the UN really sided with the RPF invaders. You know, they helped the RPF march south when the UNAMIR, United Nations something mission for something Rwanda, the actual what that acronym stands for is in my article. I don't remember off the top of my head, but the UNAMIR forces, when they showed up in Rwanda as so-called peacekeeping forces, they went to where the RPF was in northern Rwanda. They hadn't really been able to break past Habyarimana's army, and the UN forces helped them march south and set up base in Kigali, in the capital. And then later on, the UN forces shut down one of the runway. There were two runways in the Kigali airport. They shut down one of them, making it so that any approaching plane could only land from one direction. And, you know, if anybody was wanting to take a shot at a plane, it made it a lot easier. And then that's exactly what happened, is that Habyarimana's plane got shot down. So
coincidence?
Coincidence? I think so. But, you know, so I didn't really, I look at the movie as really just a piece of propaganda. I think it has helped perpetuate the military-industrial complex interests, and I think it has helped perpetuate the empire. So for those reasons, and even though I enjoy watching the movie, just knowing what I know and knowing the truth of what happened and knowing what the movie is kind of being used for, I have to give it a pretty low score. I'll probably give it a 5. I'll give it a black and red.
Wow. Yeah, you know, after hearing you say that, yeah, I don't know. The purpose in which it's being used is pretty nefarious. So yeah, I might give it a demerit.
In terms of just from an entertainment standpoint, I mean, it is a good movie. It's fun to watch. You know, like I said, if it was just a piece of fiction, I would probably give it an 8. You know, a 7.5. But the fact that it's really, you know, what it's being used for, you know, like you articulated, Daniel, I take issue with it. And War and Peace is, you know, I came into the libertarian world through Ron Paul, and his 3 biggest issues were War and Peace, the Fed, and the war on drugs. And War and Peace was far and away number 1. And I've kind of, I think I agree with him 100%. And, you know, being that this movie kind of is being used to perpetuate the, you know, like I said, the empire and the militarism, yeah, I got to give it a low score.
Yeah, it is unfortunate that there really is. We're living in a time of so much media. There's just massive amounts of media, and people are one of the most entertained we're probably the most entertained human beings that have ever existed, right? I mean, there's just so much available, and it's really rare when one piece comes along and it really catches your attention and makes you want to deep dive into that topic. Most of the time, the vast majority of the time, people watch the film like this and see it kind of more as a documentary, more as like the definitive, like how many other movies have been made about this time? So this is all we have to go on. So yeah, I guess I know all I need to know about Rwanda. So
people getting their history from movies and TV shows.
Yeah, I mean, it's Rwanda. Just the word Rwanda conjures up all kinds of images in people's heads. I have arguments or discussions with people that I'm close to about the need to end militarism and the need to end empire, and people are always like, well, what about Rwanda? What about cases where we need to intervene? And it's movies like this that kind of perpetuate that mindset.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to need to end it here, guys. It was a really good discussion. And if people want to hear some bonus content where we started to talk about this movie for about 45 minutes and had to abandon ship, I think we said a lot of different stuff tonight. So if people want to get even more content that's unique and related to this particular movie, hit us up on our Patreon at lastnighters.com/Patreon, and you can get full access to that hour and 16 minutes of recording. You can also get the pre-show from this night's recording, and we're about to get into some Kathleen Turner Overdrive, which is bonus content after the show where we get a little bit looser, hang out just a bit more. And next week, Roberts, we thought we were done. We thought we were out, but they're pulling us back in. Keith Knight is pulling us back in. We're doing more on The Godfather. We had a really good discussion with him on the Godfather trilogy a couple of weeks ago, and we ran out of time. We had so much more to say, and so we cut that short and said that we would come back in a few weeks. So now is the time to do that. And unfortunately, all that stuff I thought I had to say, I wrote some of it down, but now I've forgotten most of it. So I'm going to have to maybe listen to that episode again tonight so that I get some more notes about what to talk about tomorrow with Keith, because that guy can talk a mile a minute, and we love him. And it's going to be a lot of fun having him on again, talking about The Godfather. Our part 2 of the Godfather trilogy, our next episode.
Yeah, Keith the Master. He's a beast. He will be able to ride his ample hide. It's very sturdy libertarian mind all the way. So I don't know. Hopefully you'll have some memories jogged when we record that, but it'll be a good episode, I'm sure.
Indeed it will be. So join us next week for Godfather, and if you like what we do here, do give us a subscribe on the old YouTube. You can watch these on YouTube, and if you get the Patreon, you can watch us make them live. You can get pre-show and post-show content, bonus content. You can also give us a rating or review on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, wherever podcasts are sold. Ours are, of course, free for you. But what else can they do, Robert? I think there's some other ways they can support you, especially you specifically, like at Trubster.com. You have some merchandise that you make that people can get their hands on.
Yeah, there is some there at Trubster.com. It's just a redirect right now to TeePublic. But it's something I really should revisit. There are some good stuff there, but there's so many other opportunities that I could be designing for. I just haven't put my energies into that realm. But if you do want to, that is the place to do it. And thanks for listening. It's been another episode of this podcast. I enjoyed. Thank you all for tuning in.
All right, everyone. And thank you, Jared, for being our guest. And we'll get into some Kathleen Turner Overdrive right after this. And good night from last night, everyone. Peace out.